Welcome to the Political Philosophy Podcast. I'm Toby Buckle. In our current political climate, we unavoidably talk a lot about bigotry. And like any big political concept, it's worth taking a few minutes to just think about what we mean by it. What is that word doing? Can we attach a definition to it? My guest today, Nicholas Mitchell, has written a book on just that, titled On Bigotry: 20 Lessons on How Bigotry Works and What to Do About It. This is a conversation in three parts. To start with, we look at what bigotry is. We then discuss some framings of it that float around in popular culture that Nick argues are unhelpful to understanding it. We're not able to get through all of his 20 lessons. I do recommend the book if you want to go through all of them. But we close with one that I've been thinking a lot about recently, which is, in Nick's words, you cannot compromise with bigotry. I've been thinking about this quite a lot in the UK context, where we have a government attempting to see off a challenge from the far right by making concessions on refugee rights, immigrants' rights, and trans rights. I also think about it a lot in the US and the conversations we have about how to oppose the Trump administration. So it was a real pleasure to talk with someone who's thought about this in a really sustained way about what's becoming an increasing bugbear of mine. So, without further ado, this is You Cannot Compromise with Bigotry with Nicholas Mitchell. I am joined today by Nicholas Mitchell. Nick, thanks for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
So, to start with just a conceptual definitional question, you just wrote a book called On Bigotry. What is bigotry?
Well, I mean, there's a couple of ways to define it. You have the Merriam-Webster's definition, which is, and I'm paraphrasing, a person who is just really devoted to their opinion, typically about, racism, sexism, just really kind of intolerantly dedicated. But the way I define it in the book is I think of it more as a identity.
Hmm.
And so therefore, it is a worldview, it is a belief that the proper arrangement of society is one in which it's separated into those who are deemed superior and those who are deemed inferior, degenerate, or threatening. And the people deemed inferior have no rights that the superior are required to believe. So I think if we put it in a more political parlance, bigotry is a form of identity politics. And in that sense, because it is an identity that people create entire, you know, methods of reasoning and moral codes around, and it really does occupy all aspects of their life.
How would you compare it to a traditional political ideology? So I'm, thinking, listening to you, you could probably say the same thing of liberalism, right? It is part of my identity that I'm a liberal. I can give you rational reasons why I believe in it, but there also is an emotional expressivist component to it. That it's how I like to think of myself and how I present myself to others, and a lot of the time it's you reason from that rather than reason
Yeah,
to it, right? Could you think of bigotry as a political ideology, albeit perhaps a thin one?
absolutely. I think you can have, and I would say that, and I make this point in the book, that bigotry is its own political ideology, and it will wear whatever costumes it feels will help advance its cause. So it'll cosplay as a liberal, it'll cosplay as a leftist, it'll cosplay as a conservative, but it has its very own dedicated ends. And so in that sense, it is. like I said, it's a form of identity politics, and it does eventually really become the core of who a person is.
I want to come back to that become the core bit, but I mean, I think one thing that isn't is sometimes understood but is useful to understand, I'll put it that way, about political ideologies is they're not absolutely all or nothing. You can hold one and express yourself through another. And that's
Yeah.
not just bigotry. You could have a conservative makes his case in classically liberal language, or, um, I could make the case for, say, gay marriage in a sort of libertarian way. I could say this is a contract between two persons. I could make it in a liberal way. I could make it in a leftist way. These are languages that we can pick up. And I think sometimes people get really blindsided by that, that if someone's talking in, say, a liberal language, it must mean they're consistently liberal across the board, as opposed to that is a rhetoric that is at their disposal.
Yeah. Um, well, the thing with bigotry, I mean, only the most galling bigots. So think of like your David Duke types. They will, those are the only people who will really get out there and just make it plain. Your white supremacist, your manosphere types. So they put it on Front Street. Um, the other types of bigots who I would say are really, I could argue maybe the more majority of them, but very much the ones who are more active in creating policy and law. They do exactly what you're talking about. They'll start pulling from whatever they want. Like you see this with the replacement theory people that the language of invasion isn't working anymore. People are really recoiling from that, and I think you saw that really come to the surface with the reaction and the culture, because I believe all politics is downstream of culture. People who were really upset about the Super Bowl halftime performance because it was in Spanish.
Hmm.
So now you're starting to see this interesting pivot towards using the language of Western civilization and the classics, and very much over the objection of your classics scholars and the people who are really into studying Greece and Rome, and really a lot of folks who talk very intelligently and eloquently about Western Civ. And that's because bigotry itself, contrary to I think what we think, bigotry is an umbrella. So, you can put racists, sexists, all these different anti-Semites, Islamophobes, transphobes, all under this big umbrella. So they're not like that. I say that is a difference between them and other political ideologies, which are more tight around a larger core. The, they will, I mean, they'll dress it up with whatever they have to, and they will appropriate whatever they have to try to sell it to really your ordinary person, because bigotry requires a critical mass of people in a society to start doing bigoted things, or implementing bigoted laws.
Do you think let's just take the US case, that there are some people who are feeling at the moment, and they might have slightly overreached, but that they are reaching that critical mass, because I think there's a decent case to be made that a lot of people are starting to drop that facade and use increasingly open people
Yeah.
in the administration. I think Elon Musk is a good example here of someone who posts very openly about this.
Yeah, I think you're right on that one. I think for the last decade, you've had, a lot of, various types of bigots feeling very emboldened, and now they can just come out into the open. Um, because I think, they believe they had strength in numbers. And one point I make in the book is I call it the iron law of bigotry: is given enough given enough time and opportunity, a bigot will unambiguously confirm their bigotry in word or action or both. So yeah, I think you're very much seeing that spill out into the open. But that's also why I think you're also seeing this very pronounced resistance to bigotry. That I think a lot of people, especially in the United States, Yeah, I think one of the more clever things bigots would do is they would hide their rhetoric. So it becomes this sort of debate. Well, is that racist or is it not racist? And, the whole language around, snowflakes and you're overreacting and, that sort of trolling, because, like Sartre said, when he's talking about anti-Semites, they're not bound by language. They can play with language. But once all that costume goes away, and you start putting it all on Front Street, I think one of the more interesting things that's happened in America, it's like this historical memory just kicked in. It's like, oh, we recognize this. And people are like, no, you will, no, we're not selling that. We're not going with that. So that's why I see in the United States, you're having these very pronounced clashes where the euphemisms are gone. It's just it's very just out in the open. And I think that is showing a lot of one. I think for a lot of people who are bigoted, I think they overestimated the amount of support they had. I think they didn't consider that you just had a lot of people being quiet because they were watching, and now they've absorbed enough, and they're like, no, and that's across all demographics and I think political groupings.
I think a lot of the American right assume that anti-racism is generally insincere. That the commitments of, the woke people, if you want to call it that, were entirely performative.
Mm.
And that as soon as they really came out, we'd stop pretending. And I think they're a little surprised, honestly, that it hasn't happened. Let me call your attention back to one thing you said, which was historical memory. I find that interesting because something I'm writing about at the moment in a different context is there's been a debate in America over, the past 10 or 12 years, the Trump era, if you want to call it that, of how vigorously do we, on the anti-Trump side, name the beliefs that we're opposing. I think it's been pretty clear that Trump says racist things from the beginning, but there has kind of been a taboo against saying that. There's been a long running academic and public debate about if we call it fascism, how directly do we call these things what they are? And we've won that debate. Maybe not at the elite level, but at the popular level. Like the Democratic primary base is ready to call it what it is, whereas 10 years ago, perhaps they weren't. And I find it just, I mean, it's consequential, but I also just find it an interesting question of why have we won that debate, given that we on the, yes, let's just call it racist side, have not necessarily had the loudest megaphones. We've been outgunned in a lot of ways, but we've still won the debate. And I wonder if what you said is part of it. There's a historical memory here, like overt legal discrimination against Black Americans is just about still within living memory. Like there is some
Mhm.
sort of certainly a lot of people who were raised by people under
Yeah.
segregation. Um, I wonder if that historical memory is we've been able to tap into and activate that in some ways is part of the answer there.
I believe so. And I want to bring your article about the Cassandras into it because I think that's the thing that has animated the Cassandras. That's the thing they drew on was historic memory. And yeah, I mean, you're exactly right. My parents they were adults when Jim Crow ended.
Mm,
And being from Louisiana, we very, all my white friends, their parents, I'm 43, so for millennials. And even for Gen Z, for a lot of Gen Z people, they're talking about the grandparents who have this active memory of this American form of fascism, which Jim Crow was. And I think what has happened is once a lot of the bigots of multiple varieties felt really emboldened, I think in a lot of other people, it just started it they remember things they were taught in history classes. They remember, you know, to me, in the United States, fascism is very much part of the American story. Like, we go to World War II and we fight the fascists. And there are movies about it, TV shows. I mean, there's that classic joke about how the History Channel for a long time was just World War II documentaries after that. You also have really the very critical work of of Holocaust educators who really were drilling in multiple generations, these are the steps of fascism and the steps towards oppression and genocide. And, I think it was the rhetoric and the movement. Like, when these guys decided to step out into the light and just be unapologetic with it. I think just in the culture itself, just a critical mass. We're like, okay, now we recognize exactly what this is, and they zero in on it. So, you can try, bigots have tried to, like, well, let's try to paint it. We're talking about white supremacy. Let's try to paint it as Western Civ. Let's hijack that. Or if, you're talking about the manosphere, well, they're gonna hijack, which is a very real concern about, men's mental health and what they call the loneliness epidemic. But I think what's happened is that historical memory kicked on. And now you have just a great many millions of Americans who look at this and like, we're wise to the act. So they're not afraid anymore. They're just angry.
I think the Democratic primary base are apocalyptically angry right now in a way that's
Mhm.
not understood by. I think a lot of people in the press assume that they understand liberals well, and that's easy. I'm talking not Fox News, but like your New York
Yeah.
Times, your CNN. So they assume that they already understand the liberal point of view. And the interesting thing is covering, the Trump voters in diners and so on. But they actually are really, really out of touch with where the average liberal is now, I think. And
Mm.
the average liberal sees that. Like you mentioned the Cassandras, none of them, not one of the people I interviewed had good things to say about the mainline media.
Yeah. Well, one thing I'll say is, and I respected all of the stories. They would go, interview Trump voters,
Mm,
at the diners. I mean, that's good journalism. But I'm like, why don't you go to like Grambling, Louisiana?
mm,
There's a HBCU there, and why don't you interview those people in those diners to get a fuller picture, of the country? I think we often labor under some assumptions that if we acknowledge them really change the story. So, this is one I've raised multiple times. I wrote an article on about this last year, like right after inauguration day,
mm,
was that Trump's coalition that put him in office really both times, and even in 2020, they're multiracial,
mm,
they're multi-class. And I think that's one of the things that a lot of people don't want to engage with in their understanding of American politics is that, for however we wish to describe the current president, he was put in office by a multiracial coalition. And the thing I ask people is like, what does that mean about the American electorate, even going forward? Right. So even to today, is that coalition still there? Because I mean, I think, a lot of times people will get very ideological about politics and they forget the math.
mm,
And, multiculturalism in the United States it's a fascinating thing to study because I think we have a lot of assumptions really based on the past, the post civil rights consensus about, well, people are going to, demographics is going to vote certain ways. I think, I think Obama really shattered that.
mm,
And, really, when I think of this time period, I think going back in history, the two pillars will
mm,
be Obama and Trump. How do they remake the American electorate? And, so to your point, I think a lot of people are ignoring just the material realities of these last, this really going back to 2008. And that's why they struggle to understand it. It's because they simply don't want to acknowledge there's some hard truths. And I know for people, on the left, and I mean by left, I mean from the center left all the way to far left,
mm,
the multiracial nature of Trump's coalition is one that I think maybe it's confounding to them. But if you're going to engage in any sort of politics, then you have to sit with that. And I think that's also something that the right itself is trying to wrap its head around. It's, okay, how do we, in a multicultural country, and the United States is about to become majority and minority, I think the next 20 years, what does conservative politics
Hmm.
look like? And against the background of this, you have all these variety of bigots just coming in and out of the political atmosphere and really, you know, gaining power, losing power, and you get these big flashpoints. And I really think we're in one. I think we're in a flashpoint of the that most American of fights, right? Who are we and who do we want to be? And it's always multiracial. I mean, that's a multiracial fight in the United States.
How do you start thinking about that then? I mean, that I mean, one of the ways I've processed thinking about that is it's not as if I think bigotry is a huge force on the political right. It's not the only reason people
Mhm.
vote Republican, but also bigotry is almost like a Venn diagram. There's overlaps. There's people who
Yeah,
you mentioned the manosphere get brought in and invested. I think there are a lot of people in America who feel, perhaps subconsciously, perhaps to a degree consciously, that something's gone wrong with gender, that men are no longer respected,
right.
core men as they used to be. And those people are not all white, you
Yeah,
know? And I think that's, yeah, I think that has been a bit of a challenge for liberals to think about a bit because we don't want to say, for understandable historical reasons, we don't want to say negative things about a minority group. But the bigotry isn't just race. There's also, you could also talk about immigration. There are one of the things Trump's done quite well, I think, is play to anti-immigrant sentiments that might exist within non-white populations. Like I think a lot of people laughed at his talk about black jobs, but there are people for whom that resonates. And yeah, I don't know. I don't know how you think about that.
well, I think one of the great errors of the last you know maybe the last almost 20 years
Mm,
was this interesting belief, and I don't know if you remember this. You used to see it around a lot, you see it less now.
mm.
Was prejudice plus power equals racism. That symbolic equation. It was always wrong. And
Yes.
I mean, the first reason it was wrong was and her name escapes me, but the person who came up with that, the actual equation was prejudice plus institutional power
Mm,
equals racism. She was talking about oppression.
yeah.
And yes, you absolutely have to have institutional power to oppress someone. Um, but this notion, and it was a strange notion that, well, like I as a black man, let's say that I hate white people.
Mm.
Um, and for the people who may try to clip this, I do not hate white people. But what will happen? But if I'm like, well, it's not racism for me, it's prejudice. You're trying to create this strange gradient that makes no sense. Of course, it's racism. It contradicts with how we would typically talk about racism. So interpersonal, institutional, systemic, right? Yeah, anybody can be a bigot because it's being a bigot starts with being interpersonal. That you have this hatred, and you can do some terrible things in the name of a institute of interpersonal bigotry. You can, I mean, you commit hate crimes with that, and so I think that was one of the first
I think
strange things.
people want to say that because they want to rebut a false equivalence, right? They hear, oh, well, there's this anti-white racism too, and black people can say bad things about white people. And, I think the response is, yeah, but like this is a 1% thing versus a 100% thing. Like one of those is just a much more important
Yes,
systemic and structural problem than the other. That's what they're trying to say, right?
yeah,
And I guess maybe that can then morph into like it is actually conceptually impossible for there to be such a thing as anti-white bigotry, Whereas you're saying that claim goes too far. The you want to just stop and say, yeah, both are possible. One matters more than the other.
Well, yeah, the if we were talking about like bigotry of within, let's say like within the anti-racist movement, like, being like, well, we hate white people. Yeah, I mean, you can't oppress white people, but the problem that you're going to run into with it, if you're going to run into like an anti-white bigotry is it completely contaminates your work.
Hmm,
How can you be anti-racist and hate white people?
hmm,
And one, you will not be able to form the solidarity that you're seeking, and all, and it'll expose you as kind of being a hypocrite. And I think this is important for you because if you look at like, like the civil rights movement, you look at the Black Panther Party, like there's this strange, you see some people on the internet talking about, well, the Black Panther Party wouldn't care about immigrant communities. And I'm like, I have no idea what Black Panther Party you're talking about because they were explicit
hmm,
about caring about other communities. I mean, the whole notion, Jesse Jackson just died. The whole notion of the Rainbow Coalition came out of Fred Hampton,
hmm,
who was making these communities and these solidarities with, Hispanic people and with poor white people. I mean, Martin Luther King himself, when he's assassinated, he's going after the Poor People's Campaign.
hmm.
And, he's talking about he wants to go to Appalachia and all these places. But I think when we talk about something like that, and you had to, that bigotry is taught, it's not inherent.
Hmm,
Because if bigotry is inherent, then what are we doing? Like you can't fight what's natural.
hmm.
You claim that bigotry is human nature, there's really nothing we can do. But so when you look at like a group like the Civil Rights Movement, who is explicitly anti-racist, and a lot of that is based on their this ultimate gamble. The Civil Rights Movement looks at white America and says, I don't think all of these people are racist. And I think if presented with the moral opportunity, a moral interest convergence, they will turn on Jim Crow.
Or at least
They,
they're capable of not being racist.
yes, yes, that they can walk away from it or they can reject it. And, to take down Jim Crow when the Southern states were supremely powerful in the federal government. I mean, it's revolutionary. And he won. The civil rights movement won. That gamble paid off because it was correct. So, but no, like I mean, interpersonal racism and oppression are definitely they're interrelated. You need one for the other, but I try to be specific. So I'm like, anybody could be a bigot, but it requires a lot of power to oppress people.
Hmm, right.
And people will claim, it's the old saying, people who are losing power will start claiming they're being oppressed. Like, no, you are becoming equal to your fellow citizens. And so I think, you have that sort of fear because, that's the replacement theory fear. It's like, you know, what happens when we become a minority? So in a weird way, replacement theory people, they openly acknowledge the history of racism and sexism and all of that because they're afraid of revenge.
How big a problem do you So I agree with you. I think you can approach bigotry within the same ballpark as you can within, say, a political ideology. People aren't naturally liberal, I don't think, as a liberal. I think it is a belief system that people are, it's certainly very culturally ingrained and it has a, long history, but like it's not naturally arising, right? I think that's true of bigotry. I think there can be a view, particularly with racism, that this is just some intrinsic property of white people. I guess my question would be like, I don't agree with that, but like, I also like haven't spent a lot of time critiquing it. Like, it just seems like of the 10 biggest problems in the world, I don't know, and maybe just positionality and like, how am I going to come across as a white guy if like this is the thing I really get worked up about? But I do, I mean, it's not. that it doesn't. I mean, I'll tell you an example. I saw someone who was a diversity and inclusion trainer giving a talk, and I think they were well-meaning, and they said, prior to white colonization of the world, people lived peacefully in harmony with nature, and there wasn't oppression and empire. And I'm like, okay, I get where you're coming from, which is European imperialism was very bad, but none of what you've just said is true. And like, as a white guy, I sort of go back and forth. I mean, this was just me watching a video, but like, if I'm in the room with that person, I'm going to put up my hand and go, what about ancient China or the Aztecs or the Assyrians? And I don't know, like how because like I don't agree with it, but at the same time, it just sort of feels like, is this the thing I'm going to use my political voice to get worked up about? Do you understand maybe
Yeah.
that tension that I'm experiencing there?
Yeah, I do. The way I understand it is, and I'll talk about it in this frame. We have this weird frame in the United States. It's people of color versus white.
Hmm.
And that pretends that people of color are all getting along.
Yeah.
They are not.
Yes.
And you can have bigotry within that people of color
Yeah.
range. So my thing is when we have this notion of and I understand what the person you're talking about is saying is like, the way I guess I would talk about it is, well, race was imposed on the world
Yes.
by European colonization. Bigotry was not. Bigotry, you have different groups long before there was race. They had problems with each other and they had stereotypes and all that. And then as, Europe conquered the world, they came up with this strange idea from the Iberian Peninsula
Hmm.
to start categorizing human beings in, really to justify who's going to be a slave on these plantations in the New World and who could be a slave in perpetuity
Hmm.
based on skin color. And, despite the fact that, when we talk about races, you know, of all the social constructs I really, I encounter, race is just the most demented and silly because you want me to believe that all these people on these continents are the same because they have melanin, the similar melanin? That's bonkers when
Hmm.
you say it out loud. I want to say Ta-Nehisi Coates has said that like if you were to ask someone how do we categorize humanity, what's an effective way? Skin color wouldn't tell you anything. Somebody from Ghana and I take somebody from Ghana and somebody from Ethiopia and I put them in the same room unless they have a language they both know, the they're not going to be able to communicate. Same thing. I take somebody from Ireland and somebody from Estonia. They won't be able to communicate because the cultures and the languages are that different. They're going to have to figure that out. But I think when we really go with these weird frames of it's white versus everybody else, that's going to create a lot of issues because you're not going to see a lot of things. And also, I mean, the white relationship with all these different groups is different. They're not all based on the black experience.
Hmm.
If you're not black, the black experience is not your experience. So I think we have this tendency to try to make bigotry and racism, we try to clean it up, I think, to make it intelligible because it's so deranged. And I think that's a mistake. I think sometimes you just have to look at something and be like, that is demented. And it's demented and it operates in a demented way. And I think we also forget that a lot of forms of bigotry they're really intertwined. So, with the nature of bigotry, like so, if I say, you have a person and they hate black people.
Hmm.
Well, by definition, they're a racist. They're also sexist because they're black women. They're also anti-Semitic because they're black Jews. They're Islamophobic. They're ableist and so forth and so on because none of us actually exist in a single group.
Why do they tend to correlate? So you mentioned
Mhm.
the manosphere. One of the things I think that's clearly happening there is people get drawn in and they adopt sexist views.
Yeah.
But then as they develop, they will also often start adopting racist views.
Mhm.
Another example I would give you is in the UK, we've had a very strong movement against trans people.
Yeah.
And one of the things I've noticed, one of the perhaps differences with the UK trans debate is it's oftentimes the people really leading it and absorbed by it have been on the political left, whereas I think in America they'd be more on the political right. And what's happened is you had people who were perfectly normal centre of left sorts who became very anti-trans, and now they've adopted all these other views as well. Like it's consumed their entire personality, and one form of bigotry seems to have like branched
Yeah.
out into others. Why do they? Not always you can, but like, why does it seem like one brings you into the others?
Well, I think I mean broadly it's because if you believe one silly thing, you will likely believe other silly things.
Right.
It becomes easier. But when we talk about the manosphere, we're talking about masculinity, and if we go to, an American example, those masculinities are often raced.
Yeah.
So, so you get like a white guy who gets sucked into the manosphere and he becomes sexist, but he has this particular idea of masculinity that conflicts with black masculinities. Also, being that, this gets into competitions and what people feel are threatening. And then so that opens it up to, well, it's not just that, I'm a man, it's that I am this Eurocentric definition
Yeah.
of a man. And then, of course, you have a lot of black men in the manosphere,
Yes.
and they have some of them, because some of them will just try to adopt, in that weird respectability politics way, a Eurocentric definition of masculinity that's narrow. But others, it's this interesting creation of this kind of mythical masculinity that's rooted in Africa, and of course none of it's actually rooted in Africa. But and of course but they all hate the the masculinities that are really opposed to their sexism, because no, I don't care what type of bigot they are. Bigots reserve a special amount of hatred for the members of their own communities that oppose them. And so I think that's what you see. It's this so the manosphere is this sort of roiling, just clash of how do we define masculinity, and they're grabbing these archetypes that are all fictitious, when they could just you could just define your masculinity in a way that's healthy and maximizes your happiness and your agency, and you're not basing it off of oppressing women or hating trans people. um
I mean,
but
thinking about it along the lines of they reserve a special hatred for like the sellouts, I think one thing on this sort of race gender intersection you really
Mhm.
see on the modern right is they've really started understanding white women as like race traitors. Like
Mm.
liberal white women are like the devil to them now because younger women of any race, but including white women, overwhelmingly vote Democrat these days. And like on a lot of polarization is driven by young women. They're the ones who are pulling socially liberal as middle-aged men pull socially conservative. And the amount of hatred that this sort of racialized masculinity worldview has for them is really something. Um,
Well, one thing we know about white supremacy, and this goes back to the Civil War. And I think something people forget is that, we talk about, white supremacy is baked into the DNA of the United States. Well, so is the resistance to white supremacy. And it's always been multiracial.
yeah.
But I think that, every bigotry requires, like, you have to have a really impressive mass of your own people behind this, because if you don't, it won't work.
Mm.
So those are the people. And if you're like a replacement theory person, um if members of your own community are opposing you, then you can't afford that.
Hmm.
Like it'll blow up your politics. And I don't think that's particular to to people going after, liberal white women. I
No,
mean,
I mention it only as an example of what
yeah,
you're
as an example,
saying.
yeah, I think we see that everywhere. I don't care who it is.
Yeah.
Just this, you know, you get guys, who are bigots just going after the people who disagree with, like you really see this with, I think, with male, like kind of, manosphere types. They just have a burning hatred for the men who oppose them.
Yeah.
And which is why that solidarity across these lines, and being, which intrinsic to being anti-bigotry is what's the biggest thing that can stop anti-bigotry? It's the integrated community
Hmm.
because it's a unified force against these people trying to separate them.
Hmm.
So, because as long as we're integrated, we can figure this out. We can figure these problems out. Culture can be understood and sorted, and the culture's going to change. It's going to blend. It's going to creole, as I think as we would say in the social sciences, and not fearing that is a wonderful thing. But yeah, you just have this, it's this, like, bigots are just so weird, like, and
Uh,
messed up on so many levels. Um,
the
and
manosphere types are a good example of that. They're all such fucking freaks. No, not I'm not gonna say everyone who watches that content, but like the thought leaders, these are not people you should be interested in emulating. You
yeah,
know, like
like Toni Morrison has this wonderful quote, and she's talking. I mean, she does is this interview she did with, and I have her name in the book. I think it may be Wint, who was like Australian journalist, and she talks about seeing white moms attack a bus
mm,
full of black children, and she wonders, she's like, could I ever get any amount of black women to do that? And she didn't believe she could, and that how just shocking it was. And then, she has a very kind of famous quote on the Charlie Rose show talking about, you know, how bigots are really victims. They victimize themselves and how they're just bereft.
mm,
Like how weird do you have to be to you're afraid, like you get uncomfortable when people wear different dress and eat different food and speak different languages. That's just strange. And the things you end up justifying in the name of your bigotry really does turn you into, James Baldwin talking about people during Jim Crow. It turns them into moral monsters. This is how you end up lynching someone. This is how you end up committing all sorts of atrocities. And I think, people we generally are like, well, bigotry is just the result of ignorance. I disagree. I think it's the moral commitment and the political commitment. And I think when we begin to think of it like that way, then we have an understanding to oppose this. That you're like, no, you are trying to create moral panics so you can get away with doing things, and you just want to brutalize people.
one of the questions I think we often don't ask about political ideologies, but is a very valid one, is do they make people happy?
Mm,
Are they a useful guide to live your life? Are these gonna, because we face endless small decisions every day, right? And your political ideology is part of the software running in the background that helps you make them, helps you decide how you're going to feel about something. If you witness an act of discrimination, are you going to say something? Are you going to agree with it? Are you going to keep your head down? That we'll all be confronted with that choice at some point in our lives. And I think one very obvious point to make against bigotry, none the worse for it being obvious, is it's clearly not making people happy. Like its adherents tend to be almost uniformly pretty miserable. And I think that's a valid reason to critique it. And
yeah.
something you could also point to on our side is, there's this idea in Christianity of witness, which there's sort of highfalutin explanations, but the basic idea is you want to live your life as a walking advert for Christianity, such that you're showing that it is a practical way of navigating an imperfect world. And I sort of sometimes wonder what would the secular equivalent look like? What does liberal witness look like? What
Mhm.
does anti-racist witness look like? And I think that is a way to oppose it and to think about it is like never even mind the harm you're doing to other people. You're clearly unhappy, you
Yeah.
know.
I mean, look what bigots do to their own families. Like, a bigot is incapable of the unconditional love to be a parent
Mm,
because they will kick their kid out of the house for violating their bigotry. That's why I mean, the first lesson in my book is that bigotry makes you immoral
mm.
because it just destroys all of that you're exactly right. Like how exhausting must it be to just be outraged and angry all the time at things that you have decided, you've convinced yourself are threatening, including, and I think this is probably the thing that animates bigots the most, things they hate to see. They just hate to see the people who they hate happy,
Yeah.
just living their lives. They hate seeing integrated communities. They hate seeing interracial couples. They hate seeing, happy trans people. And, but that's what I keep coming back to. It's its own political ideology that all the other ideologies out there, liberalism, conservatism, all that, it can oppose on its own terms.
Mm.
So like, you could be a conservative, and say that bigotry violates, if we're talking about the United States, those foundational values of life, liberty, and happiness,
Mm.
and that we're trying to preserve the best of us. Bigotry is not the best of us. And if you're liberal or progressive, you can easily say that, bigotry violates progress and hurts human dignity. If you're a leftist, and you're all about Marx and class, bigotry destroys class solidarity.
Mm.
But bigots to themselves, it's the only thing that matters. Nothing else matters to them. And this is why you'll see people who are bigots oppose things that will help them.
Yeah.
And they will, because they don't want to share it, or they will embrace things that will hurt them. You mentioned, the anti-trans movement. By definition, the only way you can create, and I want to say this was Elie Mystal who said this, and this is largely true of all oppressive bills. Show me a anti-trans law that cannot be used to hurt cisgender women.
Yeah.
You can't write one. It's no different than the Jim Crow laws with voting. Yeah, black people couldn't vote. Neither could poor white people.
Mm.
And it's bigotry just destroys the intellect and just it's masochistic. It's so masochistic to watch. But unfortunately, it's animated and it does provide bigots one particular thing. It does provide them community,
Mm.
which is why I think it's very important that when we encounter people who walk away from bigotry, we have to embrace them because they are leaving a community behind. And we have to embrace them into a new community. And I mean, I think we do have to hold people accountable for their past. So I'll say, like, okay, if someone's a bigoted advocate and now they've turned on that, be as fervent in your opposition to bigotry as you was in your support for it. But we have to give people grace. It can't just be punishment and atonement forever. You can't build community on that.
Let me give you a challenge and a question. The challenge, I mean, maybe I'm not best placed to make this challenge, but I can very well imagine. I'm sort of channeling a couple of black friends here, right? Would say, I'm not. I think they would say something like this. I'm not against a lot of what you've said. It feels a bit optimistic to me. Like, okay, sure, maybe white people aren't like deeply, maybe they're not permanently racist, but it's baked in enough that I'm just going to assume that as a default. And
Mhm.
that, like, you're talking about this sort of cross-racial coalition to fight it. I don't trust white people enough for that, and I feel I have valid reasons not to, based both in history and my own life experience. And this idea of like a colorblind society, it's a nice thought, but we are so far away from that that I'm not even sure that these are
Yeah.
visions that are worth entertaining. It's we I'm again speaking as what I can imagine. Perhaps some black people might say we can only trust ourselves here. I can imagine would be the challenge.
Well, first thing I would tell them is being that you can have black people who are racist towards themselves and
Mm,
sexism and all of that. Do not bet on the whole notion you can only trust yourselves. But I understand that. I mean, as a Southerner, I've encountered a lot of racism. But the thing is, racism is taught.
mm,
It's taught. So anything that is can be taught can be unlearned and corrected. That's why I call it a curriculum.
mm,
And so, and even in my own personal life, and I think this is one of the parts of the South no one talks about, is there are a lot of white people in the South and across America, but then I'll speak to the South because I'm from there, that, you know what, if you want to be a racist and go try to talk to them about racist, hey man, God go with you because these guys are not the ones. They will get very aggressive in how dare you bring that to me. And you know, I mean, we've always had white people who were down with fighting racism and and liberation. I mean, name that comes to mind is Viola Liuzzo, who's killed during the civil rights movement, of course, with in Mississippi,
mm.
with the famous Mississippi burning case. But I'm not advocating so much for I guess for color blindness because I don't know what that means. That means 1,000 different things to 1,000 people. But what I do advocate for is a society in which we live in community,
Mm,
where and I reject the idea of tolerance.
mm,
It's a low bar, and for some odd reason, most people can't get over it.
mm,
And my reason for that is because we ask people to tolerate what they don't like.
mm.
Like, like the metaphor I use with my students is, you're on a plane and a baby's crying, you're going to tolerate the baby. It's a baby, but
Yeah.
you're not going to like it. So when people come to me as like, well, Nick, well, I tolerate transgender people. I'm like, well, what did transgender people do to you?
Yeah.
That make you tolerating? I am about accept.
Necessary, but it's necessary but not sufficient. You can't just
Yes,
stop there.
yeah. We have to accept difference, and accepting different cultures, accepting different types of people, because I mean, the one universal truth about humanity we know is that it's diverse. I'm a critical humanist in that way. I feel that how do we figure out the universalities between cultures is by looking and studying, interacting with difference. And you know, I'm glad you said it sounds optimistic because I think the one of the main things you have to oppose bigotry is hope.
Mm,
And that hope was necessary. Like, the civil rights movement, the women's liberation movement, the gay rights movement, any liberation movement, civil rights movement that's ever been has all been premised on hope that we can do better and that society can be better. And I know progress is not a myth. I know it's in vogue for some people to be like, well, there's been no racial progress or there's been no gender progress. I'm like, well, that's categorically false.
Do
If
you think
there'd been no progress,
people even really mean that though, or are they just saying, let's not overstate the progress that has been made and the challenges that remain?
I
You
think
know?
I think we can give a like we give. I think if you give them grace, they're saying they mean overstating.
Yeah.
But as a black Southerner, knowing the nature of Jim Crow, that was the end of Jim Crow was nothing shy of a revolution. I don't think there's, you know, if we're on a 100-mile journey and we've only come 45 miles, that is still significant progress. We just have much farther to go. But there's nothing wrong with admitting that there has been tremendous progress on all of these fronts, because if there hasn't, what exactly are we complaining about?
Yeah, this is another one where, as a liberal white guy, I go back and forth on how worth my time is this to make this case. Because when people say there's been no progress, I'm like, I don't think that's an accurate framing. And I also think it's a counterproductive one because if there's been no progress, it almost implies there's not going to be. And then what's
Yeah,
the point? Right?
yeah.
At the same time, I sort of think I hear what people are like, what they mean there. And I think what they mean is don't oversell it. Things are still very bad, right? Which I agree with. Um, so I don't know. I always am like unsure how worthwhile it is, especially given my positionality to like get into that debate. I like sometimes I have, sometimes a lot of times I haven't. Like I don't know. I just don't know if it's worth having that fight sometimes.
Well, I think from a political strategy point of view, you always have to assess exactly what the ground beneath your feet actually is.
Yeah.
And if you have this view that the world has not changed since Brown versus Board, your tactics and engagements will reflect that belief.
Yeah.
But if you're like, well, we're here and people are trying to push us back, you know what you're protecting.
Hmm.
And to me, it's like, recognizing there's been progress recognizes the victories and recognizes that people change. I think, like one thing we keep forgetting is that, the opposition to bigotry, it's multiracial, multi-gender, multi-class, multi-political. You have all sorts of voices, out there. And, that is a beautiful coalition, but you have to recognize the coalition is there to even begin to make that outreach. Also, this is how you recognize you have problems.
Hmm.
Like that there is bigotry bubbling up on your own side. And how do you address that?
Let's end with a tactical problem uh,
Okay.
on the other side because that one, there's been no progress narrative. I go back and forth, and I haven't. That's not been the main thing I've used my political voice to argue against. On the other side, there's this idea that if you're seeing bigotry rising, the way to deal with it is to throw them a bone, and they'll go away happy. And
Mm,
I call this view reactionary centrism, but it would be the idea that, like, well, if people are concerned about there being too many immigrants, put some controls in to like address those legitimate concerns. If people are concerned about trans people, maybe let's do a puberty blocker ban. Let's do a bathroom ban. Let's try and address what we can address, and then they'll go away.
right.
My counter argument is, well, it's never, ever, ever worked. But I think this is one I have felt that it's important to raise my voice on because this is much more consequential, right? Like
Yes.
people who say, oh, well, there's never been any progress. I think that does get you into a sort of imperfect strategic framing, but these tend not to be people with institutional power.
Yeah.
Um, the people with institutional power tend to go the other way and tend to be like, well, let's just feed the wolf a little bit, you know?
Mm,
And you have a chapter, bigots will not compromise. And that's what's at the heart of my opposition, is if we did live in a world where we could do a little bit of harm to prevent a great amount of harm, I can be a pragmatist there. But I just don't think that's the world. I don't think if you look at the Trump movement or I don't think they will ever, 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 ever be satisfied.
well, that lesson is, like any step towards bigotry is a victory for bigotry. But
Yeah, simple as.
yeah, yeah, the 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 tactical issue with that is, and I wrote about this for a MS Now essay talking about Gavin Newsom.
Hmm.
Um, the problem from a just, let's set aside everything we've talked about, and we're
Hmm.
just talking about just political organizing, big tent management. You are willing to roll on civil rights. Why are the people who only have full citizenship for civil rights, why would they vote for you? You've let them know you're willing to roll over on them because you want to pick up a percentage point or two in Kenosha. That is, it's, it's a compromise with bigotry to be sure, but it's also just anti-solidarity and just very poor big tent management. It's like a hyper theory that's rooted in nothing, and it's so many priors to get you to the point of being like, well, I think we can just back off on this long held civil rights protection, and these people will understand, and you invoke the lesser of evils and the greater of goods, which I'm like, okay, but for the lesser of evil to exist, you have to have an actual lesser of evil.
Mm,
Asking someone to sacrifice their rights to take one for the team, that's not a lesser of evil. That's just an evil
mm.
with no greater good. If we go with those frames, and no one does that. Just self interest. No one ever does that. That's why it never works. But from the bigoted perspective, it shows weakness. It
Yes.
shows willingness that you're willing to just back off a little bit, and because bigots are in this for the long game.
Mm,
They don't think in election cycles; they think in centuries.
mm.
And what was once unthinkable becomes thinkable very easily. And because bigots have conviction.
Mm.
If you're willing to compromise, because bigots only want to compromise on things of that that involve necro power and necro politics that can hurt people.
Mm.
Um, if you're willing to compromise on that with them, they know you don't have the conviction to stand against them. And also, you're not going to get their votes because, why buy the knockoff version when the genuine article's right there?
I think there's a belief on the part of reactionary centrists that it's more rational than it is. I think there's a belief that say, oh, I'm concerned about wage effects of low-skilled migrants coming in, and that's pushing me towards the Republican Party. But if someone could like address those concerns, there's maybe other elements of the Democratic Party I like that I would vote for. That's not it, man. That's just not where people are coming from. You know, um, like I always remember talking to a woman in Carlisle in England who was like, I go down Botchergate, it's like the bloody Middle East. It disgusts me. It's Carlisle is 98% white. There's one Asian store. That's what you're talking about. What's
Mm.
that woman saying? She's saying, I do not like the presence in my community of people who don't look like me. I don't like seeing foreign language in the sign of a store. I don't like seeing people talking a foreign language at any amount. Like 1% is too much for her. Like, okay, so what can you offer her? If you say, okay, well, we'll reduce the number of visas that we're gonna give or something, that's not gonna satisfy her.
Yeah. I
You
mean,
know,
politically, we can compromise on a lot. That's the nature of government. You can compromise
yeah.
on a lot. But there's a huge difference in compromising on a tax cut
Mm.
or or spending the budget, even though, a budget is a moral document, and rewarding someone's bigotry. You cannot do that because once you do that, you'll never stop.
Yes.
And you incentivize the behavior. And
It's just
you
so bottomless. There's
know,
no end to that.
I mean, anybody can live along. I think we can any groups can live alongside of each other. Conservatives and liberals, Republicans, Democrats, Christians, Muslims, Jews, atheists, black, white, whatever. We can all actually live together. But you can't live together if you think some people are inferior and some people are superior. That's an actual irreconcilable. There's no compromise with that. And I think really if there's a fundamental divide in the United States, and I'm willing to wager in the UK, I would describe it as there is a division between just those who believe that there are they are superior and inferior groups, and those who believe that we're a nation of countrymen and countrywomen.
I
And
think some people just can't process the irreconcilability of those two things
yeah,
because their self-identity is deeply rooted in being the sensible one in the middle, the one who helps the extremes on both sides calm down and see each other's point
Yeah.
of view. That's their identity. And when you tell them these things cannot be reconciled, they interpret it as an attack on their identity.
Yeah, because I think they've made it part of who they are. And you can occupy that middle ground, I think, on any number of issues, like, where, highway spending.
Yeah.
Things that are super important. But man, what's the middle ground between someone thinks I'm subhuman and someone who thinks I'm fully human? Like, am I almost fully human? Is that the middle ground? I mean, you know, bigotry at the end of the day is ultimately a profound moral issue.
Mm.
I'm thinking of, John F. Kennedy talking about, we face this moral crisis. And you go back and you look at, the vote tallies for the Civil Rights Act. It's Republican and Democrat, it's conservative and liberal for it because, you know, the it's such a profound moral issue that stretches, beyond party
Yeah.
and beyond um really political ideologies. And that's why I keep saying that, bigotry is its own thing. And
Mm.
I think, the folks you're talking about, they're trying to occupy a middle position that is really, there is none. They're just standing over a chasm
Yeah.
because you can't reconcile these two things. And I think they're really doing themselves a disservice trying. And I think it's very important to, I think the only real position is, the only justifiable position is you have to condemn all forms of bigotry. You have to oppose them, regardless of who does it and why.
Mm.
Right. So that's why I'm like, some people will be like, well, you know, anti-white racism is not that much of a thing. And I'm like, okay, that's fine. You still have to oppose it
Mm.
because we can't grant any room for any of this because all it needs is an inch
Mm.
and it will, because these guys are motivated. They want to win.
Mm.
Do you want to oppose them? That's the only question I think people who oppose bigotry really have to ask themselves.
Let's pause it there. Thank you for your time today.
Oh, thank you, man. This was a good conversation, man. I'm glad that we were able to click up.
Yeah, for sure. The book is on bigotry, 20 lessons on how bigotry works and what to do about it. Is there anywhere else you'd like to direct listeners? A website, a social? Are you on Blue Sky? I feel like you are.
I am on Blue Sky. I think we follow each other on Blue Sky. Um, I mean, the book itself is available through Bloomsbury. Of course, you can buy it through most major booksellers. There's the hard copy. There's an e-copy. I narrated the audiobook version
Oh, there's an
through.
audiobook.
Yes, which was a
Oh,
extreme experience. Never had to do that before. And yeah, and this book is written for everybody. It's not a dense academic tome.
mhm.
Um, and I hope people will check it out.
Cool. Thanks again.
Thank you.